Hey, Baba Booey, what's up? It's the Culture Detective here investigating your favorite albums. And today I'm going to do another mini albums review. It's been a long time since I've done one of these, but since I have a bunch of albums that I want to talk about, but I don't want to spend 12 years talking about them, might as well make a mini albums review video. Now, I have chosen 10 albums to be reviewed in this album, but each of them are going to be very brief because I just don't have much to talk about them because they are, I guess, mediocre. They are below average at least and okay at best, and there really isn't much to talk about. Yeah, let's go. Starting off, we have Moses Sumney's Gray. Moses Sumney, Californian art pop neo soul singer songwriter, he's back with the album Gray, making a stir, and it's sort of a double album, but it's actually not that long of a double album. It's a little over 1 hour long, and even though there are actually a bunch of songs here, I think a bulk of the songs are okay. They're pretty good. Some songs stand out to me, especially like Color, which is a very colorful track. I really love the layers of synths. I think the track Cut Me, while instrumentally not very impressive, I still think is a really good song. Me in 20 Years is easily my favorite song on the entire record. It's just very compelling, very driving, and the track Bless Me is also very great. The track Neither Nor has a lot of Tom York of Radiohead fame influences on it, and the instrumentals, it's also very driving. And the track Polly, it's alright. I'm kind of on the fence with it because while it's a pretty ballad, I mean, it doesn't really stand out all that much from the rest of the record, which is, I guess, my biggest complaint with this album is that there are just so many songs on this album. It just ends up feeling kind of bloated, given that there are also a good number of songs on this album that just don't stand out at all. They just don't feel all that important. They just feel like slow, quiet, neo soul that is kind of abstract, a little experimental, and that's it. This is a very indulgent record. Even though it has its highlights, it also has its slow, forgettable moments. So yeah, unfortunately, that's the case. I don't have a specific score for this, but if you round it to an integer, this album would be a 7 out of 10. Next on the list, we have Spanish love songs, Brave Faces Everywhere. This album is pretty. There are two kinds of people who listen to the album. The ones that immediately love it and think it's one of the best of 2020, and the ones who, after listening to it, just think it's okay. And I'm the latter, unfortunately. So Spanish Love Songs is actually not a band that makes Spanish love songs, but they are actually an emo punk rock band, and they do come out with these very loud, very 2000s-esque emo punk tracks with very expressive vocals. The vocals, they are actually very expressive on this album, which is one of the better aspects of the album. The way the vocals vibrate, I'm not a huge fan of when I first heard it, but it does give this album a pretty special quality. But here's my problem. While this album is extremely solid and extremely coherent, maybe too solid, maybe too coherent, I really wish that this album is a bit more versatile, is a bit more dynamic, because every single track on this album have the same tempo, almost have the same 4 chord progressions, and the structure is pretty much the same, and the delivery of the vocals are all pretty much the same. The whole album is one solid chunk. It sounds like one really long song. Yeah, I mean, again, if you listen to the tracks individually, like if you pick one song off of the album and just listen to it, it's actually not bad. We have tracks like Optimism and Self-Destruction, which are 2 highlights for me. The track Losers is a bit more aggressive, but sounds kind of similar. And I guess the rest of the album also sound pretty similar. And I guess that's the problem. 7 out of 10. I forgot to say the score. 7 out of 10. Oh, by the way, if I have forgot to mention this, the name of the album is Brave Faces Everyone. Brave Faces Everyone. Up next, we have Mourning a BLKstar. Mourning a BLKstar with The Cycle. And this is like a neo soul album. There are multiple instrumentalists and multiple vocalists on this album. It's a group, and it's I don't want to say this, but it's boring. This is a boring record. I thought it's going to sound interesting because the production is actually really good. It's easily the best part about this album. It's the production. It's very crisp. It's very clear. And the vocals, they're actually not bad. The way there's a thin layer of reverb on them makes it stand out a little more. But instrumentally, it's really, really underwhelming. There are tracks on this album that sound like there are no instrumentals whatsoever because they're just so faint, and it's not even because the vocals are so expressive or emotional or anything. I mean, they're good, but does the vocals necessarily bring the instrumentals up and make this album sound like transcending or anything? No. Yeah, there are tracks where the saxophones and the horns, they fall really flat. They're really sad, really flaccid, and not in a good way, not in a beautiful way at all. The drums are really slow, they're really, really quiet, and yeah, the vocals, they're pretty bad. One standout track would be the track Deluge, which is actually just a remix track, but a really good remix track. I mean, the layers of instrumentals and the vocals, they come together to make this really smooth and easygoing track is fantastic. But the rest of the album is really underwhelming. And also, again, there are like, I don't know, 18 tracks on this album. And it's just a lot. And then there are all sorts of interludes. We have a track called Whom the Bell Tolls, and it's not a Metallica cover, by the way. It's not. So yeah, I am kind of feeling a 5 on this album. Up next, we have Blake Mills with Mutable Set. Blake Mills is a minimalist folk singer-songwriter, and Mutable Set is a minimalist folk album, and it's really, really minimalist. Yeah, there are a bulk of this album, okay? A bulk of this album sound like Blake Mills just very quietly whimpering over some really stripped back and almost non-existent guitars, and that's it. It's very sparse, very faint, and again, I don't want to use this word, but it's kind of boring. There are many moments on this album that really, really feel boring and bland. However, there are tracks that are, even though slow, they do interest me a bit because of its interesting sound play, like the track Eat My Dust, which is this track that has these folky, watery guitars that are just layering off of one another, and it's really gorgeous. The track Summer All Over is also a standout for me because it sounds really eerie and scary towards the end for some reason, and it's a standout for me. The track Window Facing Another Window, it's a strange track. It's a very indulgent track, but the chord progression, there's something really muddled up about it that makes this track sound interesting to me. But other than that, a good chunk of this album feels really mundane still, and I don't really see anything all that interesting about this album. So yeah, strong 4 to a light 5 out of 10. Next on the album, next in the video, we have Kvelertak with Splid. Kvelertak is a band from Norway, and they make hardcore punk music, and I'm not gonna lie here, this album is my favorite album of the bunch that I'm going to be talking about today. Now, I don't think it's a great album. Neither do I think it's that good of an album, though if you ignore the production on the album, this album is actually pretty good. Like, it's pretty good. But the one thumb and the sore eye, the sore and the thumb. I don't know what's the phrase for this, but that one thing that bogs me is the production. Now, it's not the worst production of all time. It could have been so much worse, but it's so compressed and it's so squished in. Sometimes it really made the song less enjoyable sometimes. Like sometimes when the songs are a little bit more skeletal, maybe a little bit more stripped back, and then you have the production just pressing all the instrumentals together, it sounds kind of ugly. But there are songs on this album that really shine, even though the production is not so great, like the track Discord, which is my favorite song on the album easily. The performances are just so fiery and just so aggressive and just so forward-thinking, and it's so bright. It's really fantastic. The thing I love most about the album, the performances. They're fiery, they're very aggressive, and it's very exciting and very entertaining, and they're not just, every single song, they're slightly different. There is versatility, there is dynamic, and there are different guitar plays here and there, different vocal plays as well. It's a pretty entertaining album if you just ignore the production. I guess a decent 7 would be fair. Next on the list, we have Mujuice with Rytm Moskva, and obviously this album is a Russian house album. Mujuice is a Russian house artist, and given that this album is called Rytm Moskva, obviously this album is from Moscow, I guess. I don't even know. But one thing I know about this album is that this is a very just very sterilely produced house album, and I don't like that. I like my electronic music a little bit glitchy, a little bit more abrasive, with a little bit more personality and flavor to it. This album is like the opposite of that. It's so clean, it's so sterile, it's so rigid. It's almost like I'm watching a commercial to a really urban, modern, super futuristic city, which is weird. And then again, the tracks here, most of them are pretty forgettable. There are a couple of highlights here and there, but they're completely overshadowed by the forgettable tracks. There's one track called Quart, which I think is one of the more interesting tracks relatively, with the pinging, panging metallic sounds. But other than that, I just think it's a very underwhelming and bland house record that just doesn't interest me all that much. So overall, strong 5 to a light 6 out of 10. Next up, we have Ulcerate with Stare Into Death and Be Still. And this is one of those Blackened death metal albums that rateyourmusic.org just really love for some reason. It's not really that good. It's not as good as people say it is, I'm seeing all these positive reviews on RYM for these Blackened death metal albums that aren't even that good. And this is one of them. It's just okay. The production, it's very compressed, and it's very sequenced, and it's all squished in together. It's not very that good. It's not that good. It's kind of noisy, not in a good way, and every track sounds kind of similar. They all sound okay, like they all sound average. And that's it. The bass riffs and the guitar riffs on this album, they're not really all that interesting, not all that flashy, and it's not that they are all that aggressive or anything. There are a lot of moments on the album that are relatively spacier, so at least there's that, because on the next album that I'm going to be talking about, it's I guess not like that, So kind of feeling a strong 5 to a light 6 on this album. Black Curse, Endless Wound. All the way from Denver, Colorado, Black Curse is also sort of a blackened death metal band, and Endless Wound, it's also alright. It's also one of those metal albums that for some reason got a lot of positive reviews on RYM for no good reason whatsoever. The production on this album is better than that of Ulcerate's. Let me say that. The songwriting on this album, though, it's a little worse than that on Ulcerate, though, in my opinion, because this album, it just sounds like one solid chunk of songs, and that's it. At least on that Ulcerate album, there are moments where it's spacier, there are moments where it gets louder, but on this album, on Endless Wound, there really isn't much in terms of dynamic or progression. It's a really straightforward meat and potatoes Blackened death metal album. There are a couple of tracks that stand out a little bit more, like Charnel Rift and Encaptured by Fear. Decay, that's the Encaptured by Decay. And there are moments on this album that get sort of trippy and hypnotic and psychedelic and dizzying, and those are some really, really interesting moments. But I think overall it's just okay, I guess. Feeling a strong 5 to a light 6 on this album as well. Next up, we have Mike with Weight of the World. So Mike is an abstract rapper, and Weight of the World, I was actually pretty excited about this album when I heard the first track, Love Supremacy, which I thought was great. It was fantastic. I love the dusty lo-fi, the very bold instrumentals of the track, the very cold-blooded, the very straightforward flows by Mike. Not a big deal when the instrumentals are this bold. But for the rest of the album, Mike basically puts on a stone-cold face and raps with the same flow, with the same monotone, boring voice, and it just becomes very, very boring very, very soon. And then the instrumentals, they get more and more boring too. They get more and more sparse, more and more random and disjointed. And yes, you could say that it sounds like Earl Sweatshirt's some rap songs. In fact, Mike and Earl, they influence one another. However, the thing about Earl Sweatshirt's some rap songs, it's A, it's shorter, B, it's more emotionally raw, C, the instrumentals and the samples on that album are really interesting and entertaining, and D, Earl's pen game is fantastic. However, none of these four things show up on this Mike album, and there are only a couple tracks that I actually find enjoyable. The track What's Home 1/2 is one of the smoother tracks on the album. The beat switch is really nice, and the title track, it's more focused, but still I think overall it's not a very good album. The track Get Rich Quick Scheme has some really interesting saxophones on this track, which I think it's pretty cool, even though the performance isn't really all that great. Yeah, not much else to talk about. Feeling a strong 4 to a light 5 out of 10. At long last, we have the Soft Pink Truth with Shall We Go Sinning So That Grace May Increase. Whatever that means. And apparently the Soft Pink Truth is like one half of Matmos, which is a duo, so it's just one dude. And this album, it's a nearly ambient, maybe slightly house album. And it just sounds really mundane to me. It just sounds really bland to me. Again, very sterile, very clean, and I don't like it. However, there are moments on this album where it sounds very holistic, very beautiful, and very serene, but there are only a few moments. Even so, they fail to create a very beautiful or memorable imagery, or at least some memorable imagery of sorts, like I Love My Ambient album do. I think there's one track, I think it's Sinning, where there's a very straightforward 4/4 beat that suddenly shows up halfway through the track, and the second half of that track is slightly more entertaining than the rest of the album. Also, the track list of this album is basically track 1, Shawl, track 2, We, track 2, track 3, Go, track 4, Sinning, and it's just like it spells out the title of the album. and it's just okay. It's really not that interesting of an album at all. Feeling a 5 on this thing, 5 out of 10. Also, you know what? Allow me to review another album. The 11th album. Let's go. Because I feel like I will not come back to that album at any point soon. And that is Paysage DHiver Wald, which is this black metal ambient record. And again, it's just one of those metal albums where rate your music so crazy over it. And it's Paysage DHiver. I know that I'm butchering the name. I don't even know how to pronounce it. Paysage DHiver. DHiver. Diva. I don't know. Don't ask. Don't ask me how to pronounce it. Yeah, it's not that great. I don't know why. Maybe I need to give that album more listens, but I'm just kind of underwhelmed by the album, to be honest. I mean, when you try to mix ambient and black metal together, but not have it be drony, so it's like really blast beats and growls, but yet trying to bury them together in a way it sounds like noise, it just ends up sounding like bad production, even though it's intentional. So it really doesn't wow me or anything. And you can't find anything all that aggressive or epic like a prog metal album or anything. It just feels very straightforward, minus the production. So yeah, maybe so far a 6 out of 10. So have you listened to these albums from 1 to 10? How much did you rate them? Like if you like them, and subscribe if you want more. And thanks for watching. I will be reviewing Proto Martyr tomorrow, I promise, and also Nicholas Jar like a few days later.